Hi, thanks for watching BibleMountain.com. In this video we're going to read Job 36 and 37 and talk about how every storm has a godly lining. In our culture, when we experience a major weather event like a thunderstorm, hurricane, or tornado, we tend not to think about God's role in that event. The reason is weather is not a mystery to us. Because of our scientific understanding, we are able to explain how temperature and pressure and humidity come together and cause these storms. Therefore, we don't think about the role that God has in that storm. However, when we experience a major weather event, we should think about God because God is the one who created that power. And storms remind us that despite centuries of human achievement, we are still not able to control the weather and we cannot control these storms. Now we're going to look at three passages in this video. We're going to start with Job 36 and 37. This is from something about 2000 BC. And what we're going to see in this passage is how people used to view the weather. It used to be when a storm came through, people treated that like it was an act of God. We're also going to look at a passage from Genesis 9. This passage is right after the flood. And this tells us that when we see a rainbow, we should think about God. And since a rainbow is an act of nature and we're told to think about God when we see a rainbow, that establishes the precedent that perhaps we should be thinking about God when we experience a weather event. Then we're going to go to a passage from the 1st century AD, Romans 1. And this is a passage that tells us that nature does demonstrate God's power. And if that is true, then we should be thinking about God when we experience a major weather event. So let's get started with Job. And before we read 36 and 37, let's review the story of Job. At the very beginning of the book of Job, we're told that Job was very wealthy. We're also told that Job was very upright. Then we're told there was a dialogue in heaven between Yahweh and Satan. Yahweh reminded Satan that Job was very upright. Satan's response was that the only reason Job followed God was because Job was wealthy. Satan said if he took away Job's possessions, he would curse God. So Satan was allowed to go out and test Job. Satan destroyed all Job's possessions, he killed Job's children, and he afflicted Job with boils from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. Well, Job did not curse God. Job stayed loyal to God. However, Job did not understand why all this had happened to him, and three friends named Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar went to visit Job and comfort him during this time of affliction. And they did not know about this dialogue in heaven either, so these men did not understand why this had happened to Job. All they knew was that he had been very wealthy, and now he had nothing. So there was a long dialogue between these four men, and Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar tried to convince Job that he was suffering because he had sinned. Meanwhile, Job insisted that he was innocent. Job insisted that God had turned against him for some reason, and Job even got to the point of saying that God was treating him unfairly and had taken away his rights. When this dialogue ended, then a man named Elihu began to speak. The passage we're going to look at today is his last speech, and it's Job 36 and 37. And Elihu also tried to convince Job that he was suffering because he had sinned. And what Elihu does in the passage we're going to read today is Elihu reminded Job that storms demonstrate God's power. And his point was that Job was nothing compared to God. And that meant, in Elihu's mind, that meant that Job should not be complaining about God because Job was nothing and really had nothing to complain about. So with that as a background, let's start reading Job 36 and 37. And again, this gives us insight into how people in biblical times viewed nature. And this helps us. Sometimes the best way to understand ourselves, or sometimes the best way to understand something is to understand what it's not. And sometimes the best way to understand how we view nature is to understand how we don't view nature. And that's what we're going to see in Job 36 and 37. So let's start reading verse 1. Then Elihu continued and said, "Wait for me a little, and I will show you that there is yet more to be said in God's behalf." Notice the word more. Remember, Elihu had made several speeches. This was his last one, so he was telling Job that he was not quite done speaking yet. Verse 3. "I will fetch my knowledge from afar, and I will ascribe righteousness to my Maker. For truly my words are not false. One who is perfect in knowledge is with you. Now, the verse 4 is a very interesting verse to me. Notice the pronoun one. And what's interesting to me is whether the pronoun one refers to God or Elihu. In other words, was Elihu saying that Elihu was perfect in knowledge, or was Elihu saying that God was perfect in knowledge? Now it seems that the pronoun one would refer back to my, in which case Elihu is clearly speaking about himself. On the other hand, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense that Elihu was claiming to be perfect. Also, you have this phrase, with you, the one who's perfect in knowledge is with Job. Again, that would seem to indicate that Elihu was talking about himself. All right, let's continue in verse 5. Behold, God is mighty but does not despise any. He is mighty in strength of understanding. Now, this verse starts a passage from verse 5 through verse 12. Elihu talked about the rewards for the righteous. In other words, Elihu is going to make an argument that good people get rewards from God. Now also, notice that Elihu said God is mighty, but God does not despise any. This was Elihu's response to Job. One of the things that Job had said throughout the dialogue was that God was against him. Job kept insisting that God was treating him unfairly. Here, Elihu is simply telling Job, God doesn't despise anybody, and that was his way of telling Job that Job was wrong. Let's continue in verse 6. And remember, throughout these next few verses, the theme is, Elihu's theme was that the righteous people get rewards from God. Verse 6. God does not keep the wicked alive, but gives justice to the afflicted. God does not withdraw his eyes from the righteous, but with kings on the throne, he has seated them forever, and they are exalted. And if the kings are bound in fetters and are caught in the cords of affliction, then God declares to them their work and their transgressions, that they have magnified themselves. God opens their ear to instruction and commands that the kings return from evil. If the kings hear and serve God, then they will end their days in prosperity, and they will end their years in pleasures. But if the kings do not hear, they shall perish by the sword, and they will die without knowledge. Now, verses 13 through 15, Elihu said that wicked people get punishment. Notice the word but. This is a contrast to what Elihu had been saying in the previous verses. But the godless in heart lay up anger. They do not cry for help when God binds them. The godless die in youth, and their life perishes among the cult prostitutes. God delivers the afflicted in their affliction and opens their ear in time of oppression. Now, in verses 16 through 21, Elihu talked about Job and wickedness. Verse 16, then indeed, God enticed you. The pronoun you refers to Job. Elihu is speaking directly to Job. Again, verse 16. Then indeed, God enticed you from the mouth of distress. Instead of a mouth of distress, a broad place with no constraint, and that which was set on your table was full of fatness. What Elihu was saying here was that God had given riches to Job to try and entice Job to leave his wickedness. That's essentially what Elihu was saying here. Now, verse 7 and verse 17, Elihu said that Job was judgmental, therefore he got what he deserved. Again, notice the word but, which is a contrast to the previous verse. But Job, you are full of judgment on the wicked. Judgment and justice take hold of you. Beware that wrath does not entice you to scoffing, and do not let the greatness of the ransom turn you aside. Will your riches keep you from distress, or all the forces of your strength? Do not long for the night when people vanish in their place. Here Elihu pointed out that Job's riches were not going to keep him from distress. Again, this is Elihu speaking to Job. Be careful, do not turn to evil, for you have preferred this to affliction. The pronoun this refers back to evil. Here Elihu said that Job preferred evil, and that no amount of affliction was enough to cause Job to let go of his evil. Now, verses 22 through 26, Elihu talked about God and power. Behold, God is exalted in his power. Who is a teacher like him? Who has appointed God his way? And who has said, God, you have done wrong? Well, the answer is no one. Remember, Job, that you should exalt God's work, of which men have sung. All men have seen God's work. Man beholds it from afar. Behold, God is exalted, and we do not know him. The number of his years is unsearchable. Now, verses 27, we're in chapter 36, verse 27, through chapter 37, verse 13. Elihu talked about God and nature, and this is where we start to get into the passage of Elihu describing, illustrating for us their view of nature, their view of storms, and how storms were an act of God. Verse 27, For God draws up the drops of water, they distill rain from the mist, which the clouds pour down. The water drops drip upon man abundantly. Can anyone understand the spreading of the clouds, the thundering of God's pavilion? Behold, God spreads his lightning about him, and he covers the depths of the sea. For by lightning God judges peoples, he gives food in abundance. God covers his hands with the lightning and commands it to strike the mark. So Elihu said anytime there was a lightning strike, that was God causing the lightning to strike. Lightning's noise declares God's presence, the cattle also concerning what is coming up. At this also my heart trembles and leaps from its place. Listen closely to the thunder of God's voice and the rumbling that goes out from his mouth. Under the whole heaven God lets it loose, and his lightning to the ends of the earth. So here Elihu said that thunder was God's voice. It was God speaking. After lightning, a voice roars. God thunders with his majestic voice, and he does not restrain the lightnings when his voice is heard. God thunders with his voice wondrously, doing great things which we cannot comprehend. For to the snow God says, fall on the earth, and to the downpour and the rain God says, be strong. God seals the hand of every man, that all men may know his work. Then the beast goes into its lair and remains in its den. Out of the south comes the storm, and out of the north the cold. From the breath of God ice is made, and the expanse of the waters is frozen. Here Elihu says that God's the one that makes ice. Also with moisture God loads the thick cloud. He disperses the cloud of his lightning. A cloud changes direction, turning around by God's guidance, that it may do whatever God commands it on the face of the inhabited earth. Whether for correction, or for God's world, or for loving kindness, God causes it to happen. Now, verses 14 through 24, Elihu talked about Job versus God. And again, this is Elihu speaking to Job. Listen to this, O Job. Stand and consider the wonders of God. Do you know how God establishes his wonders and makes the lightning of his cloud to shine? Do you know about the layers of the thick clouds, the wonders of one perfect in knowledge? You whose garments are hot when the land is still because of the south wind? Now here Elihu is pointing out to Job that Job doesn't understand nature. In verse 17, he pointed out that Job's garments are hot. This was just another way of saying that Job was human, and Job got hot, especially when the land was still because there was no south wind. Job, can you, with God, spread out the skies strong as a molten mirror? Obviously, the answer was no. Job, teach us, men, what we shall say to God. We cannot arrange our case because of darkness. Shall it be told God that I would speak? Or should a man say that he would be swallowed up? Now men do not see the light which is bright in the skies, but the wind has passed and cleared them. Out of the north comes golden splendor. Around God is awesome majesty. The Almighty, we men cannot find him. He is exalted in power, and he will not do violence to justice and abundant righteousness. Therefore men fear God. God does not regard any who are wise of heart. And this is the last verse of Elihu's speech. And notice how he ended it. God does not regard any who are wise of heart. Elihu believed that Job was wise of heart. Elihu believed that God was not answering Job. Elihu believed that God was not restoring Job's wealth because he believed that Job was wise of heart, meaning that Job was proud, Job was too arrogant for God to help him. Now, as I said, that was a passage from roughly around 2000 BC. And again, this gives us an insight into how ancient peoples viewed nature. When there were storms, thunder, lightning, rain, ice, they looked at all of that as an act of God. Now, let's go to Genesis chapter 9, and this is from around 2500 BC. And here we're told that we should think about God when we see a rainbow. And this is God speaking to Noah and his family. I establish my covenant with you, and all flesh shall never again be cut off by the water of the flood. Neither shall there again be a flood to destroy the earth. God said, this is the sign of the covenant which I am making between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all successive generations. I set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a sign of a covenant between me and the earth. It shall come about when I bring a cloud over the earth, that the bow will be seen in the cloud. And I will remember my covenant which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and never again shall the water become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the cloud, then I will look upon it to remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. And God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant which I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth. So this tells us very clearly a rainbow is a sign of a covenant. It tells us very clearly that when the rainbow is there, God's going to see the rainbow. That's going to be a reminder to God of the covenant. And likewise, when we see a rainbow, that's what we should think about. That's why the rainbow is there. The rainbow is there as a sign of the covenant between God and humanity. So, we saw from the book of Job, Elihu's illustration of how ancient peoples used to view nature. We saw from Genesis 9 that the rainbow is a sign of a covenant between God and humanity. Now let's look at Romans chapter 1 from the 1st century AD. And this is going to tell us that nature demonstrates God's power. Romans 1 verse 20. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. Now obviously there's a lot of words here, a lot of concepts, a lot of truths here, and they're all important, but I want to focus in on power. Since the creation of the world, God's power, God's eternal power, have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made. And so everything that is made in the universe, in the earth, on earth, nature, storms, any of that is is teaching us, is demonstrating to us God's power. So again, Elihu illustrated that ancient peoples used to ascribe all acts of nature as acts of God. Genesis 9 tells us we're to think about God's covenant when we see a rainbow. And Romans 1 teaches us that nature tells us about God's power. Nature demonstrates God's power. And again, we see that anytime a storm comes through, you know, when a thunderstorm comes through, or a hurricane or tornado, particularly hurricanes and tornadoes, oftentimes that results in a lot of destruction. Unfortunately, sometimes people end up being killed in those events. And they're tragic events, but at the same time, they do remind us of God. We should think about God when they come through, because those storms are powerful. And God is the one who made that power. And as I said before, despite centuries of human technological advancement, we still can't control the weather. We can't control nature. We cannot control these storms. And so when these major weather events occur, we should think about God, because we can't control nature. We cannot control these storms. God is much more powerful than we are. If you'd like to receive the next episode of Bible Mountain via email, please visit www.biblemountain.com, click on follow, and there will be a place to enter your email address and subscribe to my email feed. This is a free subscription and your email will not be sold nor given away. Also, if you like this video, please use the share buttons on your webpage to like it and or share it with your friends. And once again, thank you for watching BibleMountain.com.